What happened in Las Anod in the last couple of months? It has a very long history. So, of course, you can say Somali society is divided into different clans, and this is generally not something negative. So I personally think that it's a wonderful aspect of Somali society that there's all kinds of relationships which you have on the father's side. So you have connections on the father's side, you have connections on the mother's side, and you have connections on your wife's side. And this, of course, gives you a whole universe of relations, of possible relations, which can be used for all kinds of things, for getting, for getting politics done, for establishing businesses, for getting support in times of drought or other crises. So to have a society which is based on clan, in inverted commas, I mean, to be based on all kinds of relationship through kinship is actually something very positive. The problem in my eyes starts when you start to politicize clan. This happened actually already early on in Somalia. In the 1960s, if you go back in history, when Somalia became independent, very soon there was a politicization of clanship. There were different parties established which involved different clans. There were competitions over who rules the country, and this was in a way not really based on different ideologies, but this was more based on different alliances of clans, and this also brought some inequality into the otherwise rather egalitarian Somali society. So, but I have to go a bit quicker, otherwise we will speak too long about this prehistory. But in general, it's something to keep in mind that the politicization of clan belonging, mostly on the side of the father, the second step of the prehistory of what happens actually today in Somalia, including Las Anod, is the militarization of clan. So in my perspective, the militarization of clan started in the late 1970s, after Mohammed Siad Barre's government had lost the Ogaden War, and it became weak. There have been some tensions in the military. Some military officers tried to overthrow the government in April 1978. The coup failed, and in reaction to this attack on Siad Barre's rule, his government started to abuse its own power to persecute certain clans based on their clan belonging. And I think the first clan which was persecuted by the Somali government were actually Muduk and Nugal regions, or around Galkayo and around Garowe. And this was just the beginning of what I would call the militarization of clan in the late 1970s. But then actually more important for the current history in Las Anod is the beginning of how Somaliland was founded. So all of you know Somalia, if you like, the militarization of clan beginning from 1979 actually led to the downfall of Somalia. So over the 1980s, I think everybody of you knows what happened in Somalia. More and more guerrilla groups were established. The government resorted to even harsher measures than against the Machatin. They punished the Isaac in northern Somalia, culminating in the bombardment of Hargeisa and Bur'o in 1988. Though this is all part of the militarization of clanship. And at the end of the day, the government of Mohammed Siad Barre was chased out by the United Somali Congress, USC, and the Somali Patriotic Movement, SPM. The government was chased out of Mogadishu. However, this didn't lead to a new form of rule in Somalia. This didn't lead to a new government in Somalia, because those groups who were already involved in this militarization of clan, I mean, not only the government militarized clan, but also the guerrilla forces started to militarize clan. So they were, so to say, not able to establish a new consensus for a new government for all of Somalia. So this was actually what is commonly known as Burbur. So this is the time of the state collapse, or the collapse of Somalia. And this is also when Somaliland was established in 1991. However, and this is still part of the history of the Las Anod conflict today, So this, what I call the hasty secession of Somaliland. So if you look carefully in the events between, let's say, January 1991 and May 1991, so you could see that there was a lot of movement between Mogadishu and Hargeisa and other places, and there was actually a desperate attempt, I would say, of some political leaders, including Abdurrahman Tur, Saleban Gal, to figure out how they can establish a new government for all of Somalia. However, when Mohammed Farah Aidid and Ali Mahdi split and started fighting each other in Mogadishu, in I believe it was maybe February, March, April, it was already this time in 1991, they realized that they only have the option to stay in the north, to forge something like a separate entity. Respectively, they were actually trying to get distance themselves from the ongoing or the unfolding war in Mogadishu. So they met they had different smaller peace meetings in northern Somalia, among, for instance, between Dulbahante and various Isaac clans, or among different other groups, also Warsangili and Isaac. And eventually there was this meeting in Bur'o in May 1991. However, at this meeting in Bur'o, the decision was not, the first plan was not to decide on the secession of Somaliland, but the first plan for most people involved, for most responsible people involved, was to talk about peace, to have a regional peace agreement. And as far as I know from different actors who were involved, this meeting was in a way hijacked. So Mogadishu was falling apart, a new war was starting in the south between mostly Mohammed Farah Aidid and Ali Mahdi, but also others. And the population in the north generally was armed, including many Isaac were armed. When they were the leaders of the SNM and also the traditional authorities of Dulbahante, Warsangili, Gadabursi and Ise were meeting in Bur'o, there was a moment when the local people, the armed Isaac, were taking over and were threatening the delegates at the Bur'o conference to either declare secession of Somaliland from Somalia or have violence at the meeting. And I think this all can be, this all is documented in various written sources, so this is actually not a secret, it's also nothing really new. Maybe it has become forgotten, but I think this kind of hasty secession, which was not really planned, it was not really discussed among all the people in northern Somalia, this hasty secession is one of the root causes for the conflict in Las Anod today. What unfolded afterwards throughout the 1990s is what I would call the different political trajectories between central and western Somaliland. So you had on the one hand a rather chaotic situation in Somaliland, in central Somaliland, between Bur'o, Hargeisa and Berbera, where actually between 1992 and 1995 mostly various Isaac clans were fighting each other. So it was Habar Yunus and Habar Awal fighting each other in Berbera. There were Habar Awal and Garhachis fighting in Hargeisa and Bur'o. So there was a situation where in the 1990s Somaliland was extremely unstable, and I think many of the political leaders involved were actually not believing that Somaliland would have a long-term future. I guess all of you know that the first president of Somaliland, Abdurrahman Tur, in 1993 left to Mogadishu and joined the government of Mohammed Farah Aidid, joined by several of his senior colleagues, including Mohammed Jama Ghalib and Ismail Buba and others. So they were Isa Habar Yunus, Ama Aida Galiba Ahain. So they went to Mogadishu and joined the federal government, and in a way, the unionist government. And in a way, you had already in 1993, 1994, you had a struggle in Somaliland between unionists and secessionists. However, this struggle was not between Isaac and Harti, Ama Isaac and Harti were the So the struggle was not between Isaac and the Dulbahante and Warsangili in Sol, Sanak and Ain, but the struggle was within Isaac back then. This is something which sometimes is also a little bit forgotten. So, and at the same time, when these rather dramatic political events were taking place in central Somaliland, mostly concerning people in Hargeisa, Berbera and Bur'o, people in the eastern regions, particularly in the Dulbahante and Warsangili territories, they went on a different trajectory. So there was a very important conference in Boame 1, 1993, where several Dulbahante groups came together in order to establish something like an autonomous administration for the Dulbahante territories. The same thing they want actually to do today. This was consciously happening at the same time like the Borama meeting in 1993. So if you follow it up, you can see those people who wanted to continue with Somaliland met in Borama. Those people who wanted to distance themselves from Somaliland met in Boame. Then the same thing happened after the war between the Garhachis and Habr Awal and Habr Cello in Bur'o, when the peace meeting was taking place in Hargeisa 96, 97. At the same time, the second Shir in Boame took place, which again showed that particularly the Dulbahante in those days were very conscious about distancing themselves, or some Dulbahante were very conscious about distancing themselves from the events taking place in central Somaliland. So this is clearly different trajectories, and you could follow up a similar story in the Warsangili territories. So Warsangili territories, Eastern Sanak, was from the early time in the 1990s onwards always a remote territory, which was pretty much under the control of the traditional leaders, particularly Garat Sultan Abdisalam, Sultan Hamoud Ali Shire, and his family. So another thing which is important already in those days, latest in the late 1990s and early 2000s, you could see that there are different political narratives emerging. So whenever there's a politically chaotic situation, like when Somalia fell apart, and then there was an attempt to rebuild some political order in northern Somalia, in this particular case in Somaliland, eventually the attempts to rebuild political order are accompanied by a narrative, by a political narrative. The central political narrative of Somaliland is: we have been British, we have suffered under Mohammed Siad Barre's government, we have fought against Mohammed Siad Barre's government, which is the SNM history, we won, and we established our own political entity. So these are the central elements of the Somaliland narrative. The central elements of the counter-narrative of those people who did not want to join Somaliland, particularly Dulbahante, but also some Warsangili, is we were actually anti-colonial. We were fighting, particularly Dulbahante, but also others. We were fighting against colonialism. We were Darwish. We were quite happy about the union of Somaliland and Somalia. We wanted to have bigger Somalia, Somali Wayne Banu Rabnay. Siad Barre was a strong ruler. Somalia in the 1970s was a very strong country. The rebels, including SSF, SSDF and SNM, were actually trying to destroy our country, and what happened in 1991 was the destruction of Somalia. So in a way, in many regards, this is a completely opposed narrative. This is a narrative which is very much opposed to what is happening in Hargeisa, Bur'o and Berbera. An important point actually for understanding the current crisis in my eyes is, and this is also something which is happening in Puntland right now, the introduction of a multi-party system. So throughout the 1990s, Somaliland, the division of power in Somaliland was mainly based on some kind of agreement between different clans. So they agreed on how many shares they would get in the Golaha Wakilada, Golaha Gurtida. And it was like a proportional way, it was a proportional way of dividing the power in the country. When in the early 2000s, in 2002, 2003, a multi-party system was introduced, something which is happening now in Puntland as we are speaking here. This was, in my eyes at least, the beginning of a political imbalance. Because whenever you have a system where parties compete for power, and those who are getting 51%, just a small majority, are getting the whole of the power in their hands, so basically a winner takes it all system like in the USA, which is also now the system in Somaliland, then in my eyes it's almost certain that the demographic majority is eventually taking over the country. Successful foreign policy projects which took place in the last few years. I guess some of you know that that members of the British government became very sympathetic to Somaliland. There most recently some diplomatic relationships were established between Somaliland and Taiwan. So there were quite a few cases in which Somaliland became very visible on the international stage, despite the fact that the international consensus is it's a non-recognized state and the international community recognizes Somalia. So you have on the one hand in the domestic sphere you have an increasing political imbalance, so most power positions are taken over by ISAC. On the level of economy and foreign policy you have more and more visibility for Somaliland, which of course resulted in the nervousness of those people who were against the secession of Somaliland. And this was particularly visible when you look at Dhulbahante politics in the last 15 years. So they tried very hard to counter what was ongoing in Somaliland by establishing the Sol, Sanak and Ain movement 2009 to 2011, which was the first military rebellion against Somaliland, particularly driven by Dhulbahante, focused actually, I mean, in the Haut region. And the second attempt to counter Somaliland's success was Khartoum State 2012-2015, which was actually based on the unity of many Dhulbahante groups to really get rid of Somaliland's administration and to establish something what they already wanted to establish actually in the 1990s. So in a way, what Khartoum and SSC wanted to do was something which Bo Ame 1 and Bo Ame 2, the people there already wanted to achieve. However, they couldn't. Can you continue? So you see a situation here on the map which shows you where in the western and central part of Somaliland, this is exactly where the success story of Somaliland unfolded. And in these contested areas, what is today called Sol, Sanak and Ain, between Buhatle, Las Ano, Tileh and Baran, in these areas you have counter movements. You have a drive to distance yourself from Somaliland. Or you can continue. So these are just So this is just a few pictures from my own research which document these kind of dynamics. So while in central Somaliland there was this narrative of we are SNM, we have been British, we always have been different. You had in Buhotle, for instance, this picture I took in 2004, you had the Somali flag. So people in Buhotle never felt that they are not part of Somalia. Even people in Hargeisa said Buhotle is part of Somaliland. Those people in reality said, no, we are part of Somalia, and there was never any substantial Somaliland representation in Buhotle. It was only local people administrating themselves. So Buhotle is actually a place which was quite successful in a way, distancing itself from Somaliland. This is Las Anot. Back in 2003, you can see there was a lack of development. It was a very marginalized place. It still is a very marginalized place if you compare it to Hargeisa, Berbera, Bur'o, and also maybe Boroma. So it was a very much marginalized place. And then, this declaration of the Gudigasari Soronka happened where they said we want to get rid of Somaliland administration, we want to administer ourselves. This was already happening early on, but then the meeting of the ISIMO took place. And then on the day, as you all know, when on 6th of February, when it was supposed, when those people meeting in Las Anod were supposed to issue the final decision, Musabihi's army started to shell Las Anod, and this was another turning point. Why? It showed to the people that there is actually no chance but to fight for freedom in Las Anod. Yeah. Then you had all these events, the current situation pretty much, where the Somaliland forces continued to attack Las Anod. I think there were particularly three important clashes on 6th of February, on 22nd, when armed forces Somaliland forces tried heavily to attack from the east and to capture Las Anod, and on 25th of February, when the forces of Mahat Ambashe clashed with their own cousins in the west of Las Arnot. So these were 3 very heavy battles with a lot of losses, and Dulbahante were pretty much on their own, apart from, of course, logistic and humanitarian support from other parties, including those, of course, in Puntland also, who were giving financial and moral and logistic support, and maybe also ammunition to Dulbahante. But so these were the important battles in February. And this was also actually, so you should, if you like the uprising in Las Arnot, you should say thanks to Musi Behi. Mahat ilina isa Musi Behi wayo Dulbahante wumidei, Hartiga wumidei, Interbadan. So because those events in February showed everybody that if we are not defending ourselves now, we are going to be destroyed. So because if you start bombarding a town with civilians in town, it's clear that there will be no positive outcome for you if you give in to this kind of administration which decides to bombard you. All the external attempts to negotiate failed, and what is currently ongoing is that the leadership of SSH Khatumu, which is basically Gudiga Isimada, Gudiga Serhio Soronka, Gudiga Deganka. Those 3 entities are the civilian administration of Khatumu, and they are currently trying to stabilize the situation. You can continue. So now here there are just pictures from the most recent trip to Las Arnot, where we were meeting with those traditional leaders who were currently present in town. There were 9 out of 14. Continue. So we also visited some of the damaged infrastructure, some of the damaged houses which have been bombarded by the Somaliland forces. So what? That's the General Hospital of Las Arnot. I mean, one part of the General Hospital of Las Arnot, which was hit by a mortar. I think was it end of February, probably. I'm not sure. Continue. Though these are some of the armed forces in town. I mean, in Las Arnot, you see a lot of young men armed. They have a big vehicle in the background, which has been captured from the Somaliland army. No, we can stay with this picture. I mean, one of the current challenges actually is. So I think my personal assessment is. The political administration, so Gudiga Isimada, Gudiga Serhio Soronka, Gudiga Deganka, they are on a good way. They are pretty reasonable. They are well oriented. They do a good work. They divide the jobs which they have to do. They divide the financial resources. They mobilize financial resources. They try to take care of issues. So I think, from my personal assessment, the situation in Las Arnot is rather stable. There's not a big insecurity in town. So small issues happen, but it's basically safe. So I feel safe.